All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a question that's been haunting historians for over a century. How did Europe end up in World War One?
A fascinating question.
To help us untangle this, we're looking at this academic paper.
Yeah.
It's called Balance of Power. And by the end of this deep dive, you'll see how the shifting relationships between nations basically set the stage for one of the most devastating conflicts in history.
Sounds heavy.
It is, but also really important to understand. So, to kick things off, this paper starts with a pretty bold statement about power.
Okay, that's that.
They say it's not just about military strength. They actually describe it as, get this, a divine and godly element that influences everything.
Divine.
Godly.
Right. It's an interesting take. They argue that this divine power shapes all relationships, from how we interact with each other every day to how countries deal with each other on a global scale.
Mm. So it's not just about tanks and troops, but something much deeper. Exactly. I was thinking the same thing. So how do they take this kind of abstract idea of divine power and apply it to actual historical events?
Well, they use this really interesting analogy of uh, a double pan balance.
Oh, like one of those old scales?
Yeah, exactly. Like, the ones you see in those old-timey shops.
Mm-hmm.
Each nation is like a weight on one side of the scale,
Yeah.
right? And any change to a country, like if they become more powerful economically or if they build up their military, well, that can shift the balance, tip the scales, and potentially create instability.
Ah, okay. So it's like if one side of that scale gets too heavy, the whole thing goes out of whack.
Precisely. And that's where this idea of rational war theory comes into play. Basically, it says that countries make calculated decisions about going to war based on what they think they stand to gain. Like, do the potential benefits, maybe in terms of power or land or resources, outweigh the costs of going to war?
So even when countries are thinking logically, acting in what they believe are their own best interests, they can still end up in conflict.
Yeah. And that leads to what's called the security dilemma.
Security dilemma.
Basically, when one country starts feeling threatened and builds up its military, other countries get nervous and do the same thing. It's kind of a vicious cycle.
Ah, I get it. So it's like if your neighbor suddenly puts up a giant fence and installs a bunch of security cameras, even if you felt safe before, you start thinking, well, maybe I need more security too.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Each country is just trying to protect itself, but they end up creating more tension and mistrust in the process.
So this paper is saying that's basically what happened in the years leading up to World War One.
That's their argument, yeah.
Yeah.
You had all these countries getting anxious, building up their armies, and nobody quite trusting anyone else.
So a real powder keg situation. But who are the major players in all of this?
Well, the paper focuses on the big ones in Europe at the time.
Mm.
Germany, France, Great Britain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary.
Got it. And I guess they weren't all on equal footing.
Right. The paper actually ranks them in terms of their power,
Yeah.
and at the top of the list.
Let me guess. Germany.
You got it. They were seen as the most likely to win a war, but also the most likely to disrupt the whole balance of power thing.
So Germany was like the 800-pound gorilla in the room that everyone was a little afraid of. But what made them so powerful was it their industry, their military size.
Well, they've been going through this period of rapid industrialization and militarization, in the decades leading up to the war. They had a big, well-equipped army, and their economy was growing like crazy. They're definitely a force to be reckoned with.
So a real powerhouse. And what about the others? How did they measure up against Germany?
Well, France and Great Britain, they were more interested in maintaining the status quo, keeping things as they were. Not that they weren't prepared to defend themselves, but they weren't exactly looking for a fight. Russia was kind of a wild card. They were still recovering from a revolution and seen as a little bit vulnerable. They could go either way, towards war or towards negotiation, depending on the circumstances.
And what about Austria-Hungary? They were a major power, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely a major player. But they were considered the weakest of the bunch and facing a lot of internal problems.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, they were this big, diverse empire with a lot of different ethnic groups, and not all of them were happy being part of the empire. So there was a lot of unrest, and their monarchy was also kind of weakened at that point. The paper argues that all this internal instability made them more likely to, overreact to perceived threats, and that could destabilize the whole system.
So even though they were a major power, they were also the most volatile, like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happened with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914.
Ah, right. The event that's often called the spark that started the war.
Yeah, that one. It was carried out by a Serbian nationalist, and it basically created this sense of existential threat for Austria-Hungary. Like, they saw it as an attack on their very existence, and they responded with, well, a lot of force. They issued this really harsh ultimatum to Serbia.
So even though it risked upsetting the balance of power, they kind of lashed out.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And their actions had this ripple effect. Germany, bound by a treaty with Austria-Hungary and driven by their own ambitions, they pledged their support, which just escalated the whole thing even further.
And I'm guessing the other powers didn't just sit back and watch all of this unfold.
You're right. France, they were looking to expand their colonial power, so they increased their military activities as well, which just made Germany even more nervous. And then you had the three Entente Britain, France, and Russia. They started building up their militaries too because they were getting suspicious of Germany's intentions.
So it was like a chain reaction, right? One country does something and then another country reacts and it just keeps escalating.
Exactly. And it was all driven by fear and this desire to protect their own interests.
Okay, so we've got this powder keg situation. Everyone's on edge. The major powers are all making moves. And then Austria-Hungary throws a match into the mix. Sounds like we're on the fast track to war.
Yeah, that's where we're heading. It's what the paper calls the tipping point. But let's dig into that more.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so the balance of power is all messed up, and it seems like war is almost inevitable at this point. Is that what the paper is saying?
Well, they don't come right out and say inevitable, but they definitely make it clear that the major powers had basically trapped themselves. You know, they'd created this situation where any little thing could set off a huge conflict.
Ah, I see. So it's like they built this house of cards and they were just waiting for someone to sneeze and knock the whole thing down.
Yeah, pretty much. And the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, that was the sneeze.
So even if that hadn't happened, something else probably would have. The tension was just too high.
That's what the paper suggests, yeah. Remember that quote we talked about earlier? About how power is always relative? Like how a country's power can change over time?
Yeah, I remember.
Well, that assassination was a trigger for sure.
Yeah.
But even without it, the underlying conditions were there. The balance of power had been off for years.
Okay. So this wasn't just about one event. It was about this long, slow buildup of tension, insecurity, and mistrust. And Austria-Hungary, with all its internal problems, just happened to be the one that tipped the scales.
Exactly. Their actions, even though they were driven by fear, ended up destabilizing the whole system.
It really shows how important it is to understand the balance of power, not just in terms of, military strengths, but also in terms of what's going on inside a country.
Absolutely. You have to look at the internal pressures that can lead nations to act in ways that might seem, irrational or even self-destructive.
It's not just about how many guns you have. It's also about what's going on at home, right? Their stability, their fears, all of that plays into it.
Exactly. A nation that's struggling internally, they're much more likely to see threats everywhere, even if those threats aren't really that serious.
It's like if you're already feeling insecure about something, any little thing can feel like a major attack.
Right. It's like, imagine you're feeling shaky about your job. Then your boss gives you some minor criticism, and suddenly you feel like you're about to get fired.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
It's the same with countries. If they're feeling vulnerable, they're going to overreact.
That makes a lot of sense. So this paper isn't just a history lesson. It's giving us this framework for understanding how power works in the world today, too.
Exactly. That's the great thing about studying history. You start to see patterns, You learn how things work, and maybe you can even avoid making the same mistakes.
Totally. It's like we've been given this new lens to look at current events. We can start asking different kinds of questions like what's really driving a country's actions? Are they feeling insecure? Are they overreacting? Are there internal problems affecting their foreign policy?
Those are great questions. And it's not just about individual countries either. You can use this same framework to understand the global balance of power. Like, are there any countries today that are, rapidly building up their military like Germany did before World War I? Are there any regions that are super tense because of shifting alliances or perceived threats?
Wow. Yeah. These are questions we should all be asking. It's not just about being armchair historians. It's about understanding the world we live in.
Right. By understanding these dynamics, you can be a more informed citizen.
Yeah.
And have more meaningful conversations about the challenges facing the world.
I'm already starting to see the news differently. I'm more aware of the power dynamics that are at play.
That's great. And that's the whole point of this deep dive. It's not just about the past. It's about using that knowledge to make sense of the present and to think about what might happen in the future.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I really feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how power works on a global scale.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn about the balance of power and its impact on the world.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about internal pressures influencing a country's actions. Can you give us some specific examples of what those pressures look like today? Like, how are they playing out in the world right now?
Sure, there are a bunch of examples we could look at.
So we were talking about how internal problems can push countries to do risky things on the world stage.
Right.
Can you give some real world examples of what that looks like today? How these internal pressures are shaping things right now?
Yeah, definitely. Um, let's think about economic instability for a second.
Okay.
When a country's economy is doing badly, people start to get anxious, you know, uncertain about the future.
Yeah, for sure.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems like social unrest. People start protesting, demanding change. And that puts a ton of pressure on the leaders to do something, anything to fix it.
So they might try to find someone to blame.
Exactly. Like maybe they pick a fight with another country, try to distract people from the problems at home.
It's like trying to rally everyone around a common enemy.
Right. Make people forget about their own problems by focusing on this threat from outside. And economic hardship, it can also fuel nationalism. Makes it easier to turn people against outsiders.
So basically, a bad economy doesn't just cause problems inside a country, it can actually make things more tense between countries.
Absolutely. And it's not just about economics either. You also have political turmoil. Like think about countries that are super divided politically.
Where everyone's fighting with each other.
Exactly. Lots of distrust, maybe even some extremism thrown in there. That kind of internal chaos makes it really tough for a country to, you know, present a united front to the rest of the world. And that can lead to some pretty bad decisions, miscalculations.
It's like if a country is fighting with itself, it can't really play the global power game effectively.
Right. And then you have social unrest, like I mentioned before, protests, people demanding change, all that stuff. That can force governments to act, sometimes in ways that make things worse with other countries.
So if a government is cracking down on protests at home, they might be more likely to use force in their dealings with other countries, too.
It's possible. If a government is feeling threatened from within, they might lash out, see enemies everywhere. Sometimes foreign threats can be a convenient distraction from problems at home, make people forget about what's happening inside the country.
It's scary how connected all this is. It's not just about who has the biggest army. It's about all these complex things happening inside countries that can affect the whole world.
Exactly. And that's why this paper is so interesting. It goes beyond that simplistic view of power, just counting tanks and missiles. It forces us to think about power as this dynamic system, constantly shifting.
Yeah, and influenced by all these different factors, both inside and outside a country. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I really feel like I'm seeing world events in a whole new light.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is really just the beginning. There's so much more to learn about how power works in the world.
For sure. So, to wrap things up, what's the one big thing you want our listeners to remember from this deep dive? If they could take away just one thing about the balance of power, what would it be?
I would say this. The balance of power, it's not just some old idea from a history book. It's something that's happening right now, all around us. And by understanding how it works, seeing the warning signs, being aware of how internal pressures can shape a country's actions, well, we can all be more informed citizens. We can have tough questions about what our leaders are doing, and hopefully we can help create a more peaceful world.
Well said. And to our listeners, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to look at the world with fresh eyes. Don't just accept things at face value. Ask questions. And never stop learning. Until next time, keep diving deep.